For 15 years, I thought I had myself all figured out, until one night at my friend's countryside house turned everything upside down. I came there to escape the grind of work, expecting rest, but ended up in the most honest conversation of my life. One look, one touch, and I realized I'd been hiding from a truth I could no longer ignore. Here's how it happened. I stepped onto the wooden porch of the countryside house, feeling the weight of the past few weeks start to lift. The place belonged to my old college buddy Aiden, who'd insisted I spend the weekend with him after another grueling work trip. The drive had taken 3 hours, and by the time I parked, the sun was dipping low, painting the fields around in a soft orange glow. Aiden greeted me with a wide grin, a clap on the shoulder, and dragged me straight to the dinner table. We spent the evening reminiscing about old times, like when he tried to convince me to go skydiving, and I just laughed, calling him crazy. His wife Laura chimed in with her own jokes, while their teenage son rolled his eyes whenever we got too carried away with stories. After dinner, I helped clear the plates, feeling exhaustion settle in like a warm blanket. The house was cozy with creaking floorboards and the faint smell of aged wood, and I looked forward to sleeping in without an alarm for once. Aiden showed me to the guest room upstairs, with a window overlooking the backyard. I tossed my bag on the floor, collapsed onto the bed, and stared at the ceiling as the house grew quiet. Somewhere in the distance a door creaked, and I figured it was Aiden's dad, who lived with them since he'd been on his own. I'd caught a glimpse of him at dinner, a quiet man in his 50s with tired eyes and a reserved smile. I didn't think much of it then. Sleep didn't come easy though. I lay there, my mind replaying the past few months, endless meetings, flights, deadlines. Life was rushing by, and I felt like I was chasing it, never stopping to figure out what I really wanted. At some point, I told myself to quit thinking and close my eyes, hoping sleep would take over. Tomorrow would be a new day, I thought, full of rest and nothing else. I woke up with a throat so dry it felt like someone had stuffed it with sand. The clock on the nightstand read 2 in the morning. The house was almost eerily quiet, save for the faint creak of an old radiator somewhere downstairs. I lay there for a few minutes, hoping the thirst would pass, but eventually gave in and decided to head to the kitchen for water. Careful not to wake anyone, I slipped on my slippers and tiptoed down, avoiding the creaky floorboards. When I reached the kitchen, I froze in the doorway. The light was on, a soft yellowish glow from an old lamp above the table. Aiden's dad, Richard, stood by the sink in a plain gray t-shirt and jeans, brewing tea. He turned at the sound of my steps, surprise flickering across his face before it settled into a small smile. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low and slightly gravelly, like someone used to speaking sparingly. I nodded, feeling a bit awkward, like I'd intruded on his space. "Thirst got the better of me," I said, heading to the fridge for a bottle of water. He offered me tea, and to my own surprise, I agreed, even though I don't usually drink it in the middle of the night. Richard grabbed a second mug, set it on the table, and motioned for me to sit. We sat in silence as the kettle hissed softly, filling the kitchen with a faint minty aroma. As we sat, I noticed how he stirred his tea with care, like the ritual helped him gather his thoughts. His movements were slow but carried a kind of restrained energy. I sipped my water, racking my brain for something to say to a man I barely knew. Finally, he broke the silence, asking how I was holding up in the city after all these years. The question was simple, but there was a genuine curiosity in it, and I found myself talking about work, the hustle, how you sometimes lose yourself in the grind. The conversation flowed easily, almost effortlessly, and I realized I felt at ease. There was something calming about the way he listened, not interrupting, but nodding at the right moments, like he got it. When I trailed off, he looked at me and something flashed in his eyes. Grief, maybe, or relief. I couldn't quite tell. "Nights like this make you honest, don't they?" he said quietly, and I found myself smiling, nodding in agreement. I stared at the steam rising from my tea mug, trying to figure out why it felt so easy to talk to a man I'd only known for a few hours. The kitchen was quiet except for the old clock on the wall ticking away the minutes. Richard leaned back in his chair, cradling his mug, and asked if I'd ever felt like I was running in the wrong direction. The question caught me off guard, but I nodded, because that's exactly what I'd been feeling for years. I told him about my job, how it swallowed all my time, leaving scraps for actual living, how I used to dream of something bigger but lost track of what that was somewhere along the way. Richard listened, his eyes steady, no judgment in his silence, just understanding. Then he started talking about himself, his voice softer, like he was sharing something he'd kept locked away for too long. He mentioned his breakup 2 years ago, after 20 years of marriage, and how it forced him to rethink everything he thought he knew about himself. His words were simple, but they carried weight. He talked about trying to be what everyone expected: good husband, good father, the guy who always made the right call. But at some point, he realized he was pretending, and it tore him apart inside. I found myself nodding because his story echoed doubts I'd been trying to ignore for years. We talked about how life sometimes backs you into a corner where you're too scared to be honest, even with yourself. I admitted I sometimes felt like a stranger in my own life, playing a role someone else wrote for me. Richard smiled, but there was a bitterness to it. "You know, sometimes I think it's easier to keep pretending than to deal with the truth," he said, staring into his mug like it held answers. By the time we finished our tea, I felt something intangible. I watched Richard set his mug on the table, sensing our conversation was about to cross an invisible line. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It felt alive, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Outside, the night stretched on endlessly, but the kitchen had become a safe haven where you could say things you usually kept buried. I cleared my throat, trying to gather my thoughts, and asked what he meant about pretending. His gaze grew heavier, but he didn't look away. Richard started talking, slowly, like he was choosing every word with care. He spoke about years of living up to other people's expectations, pushing down what he really felt. "I always knew there was something in me I wasn't letting out," he said, tapping his fingers lightly on the table. His voice wavered when he admitted he'd been scared to acknowledge, even to himself, that his attraction to men wasn't just a passing thought, but a part of who he was. His confession hung in the air, and I felt my pulse quicken. I didn't know how to respond, but something in me stirred. I told him about my own past, how, when I was younger, I brushed off thoughts that felt too complicated to untangle, how I'd convinced myself it was easier to follow a script than to ask questions with no easy answers. Richard nodded, and a flicker of relief crossed his face, like he'd finally found someone who got it. We talked about how terrifying it is to be honest when you're afraid of losing everything: family, friends, reputation. He shared how his marriage didn't end in fights, but in silence that grew between him and his wife as he tried to be someone he wasn't. I admitted I sometimes envied people who seemed to know what they wanted and weren't afraid to chase it. "Maybe they're pretending too," he said with a small smirk, and we both laughed, though the laughter carried a hint of sadness. By then, I'd lost track of time. The conversation had become more than just trading stories. It was like opening a door to a room you knew existed but never dared to enter. When Richard looked at me, his gaze was open, almost vulnerable. "Sometimes I think I started being myself too late," he said softly. I wanted to respond, but the words caught in my throat because, in that moment, I realized this conversation was changing me too. I sat staring at my empty mug, feeling Richard's words still echoing inside me. The kitchen remained that same island of light, but now it held something bigger than just a conversation. His confession about hiding who he really was made me think about my own secrets, the ones I'd buried for years. I wasn't ready to say them out loud, but his honesty felt like permission to at least consider them. Richard leaned back in his chair, his fingers still wrapped around the handle of his mug like it was an anchor. He talked about how, when he was younger, he tried to drown out his feelings, thinking they'd go away if he tried hard enough. "I thought if I got married, built a family, everything would fall into place," he said, his voice carrying a mix of regret and weariness. He described living with the sense that part of his soul was asleep, and how that feeling slowly ate away at him. I listened, and his words felt like a mirror. My story wasn't the same, but I knew what it was like to hide a part of yourself, afraid the truth would ruin everything. I told him about a close friend in college, someone I spent all my time with. I never called it attraction, but looking back I knew it was. I just told myself it was friendship, nothing more, I admitted, shrugging like that could erase years of denial. Richard looked at me with something like empathy. "We all do that until it gets too heavy," he said, and his words were so simple yet so precise that I felt a lump in my throat. We sat in silence, but it wasn't heavy. It felt like a bridge, like we were finally seeing each other without masks. I noticed his hand resting on the table, just a few inches from mine, and for some reason it made my heart beat a little faster. The conversation tapered off, but we didn't rush to end it. Outside, it was still dark, but I felt something shifting inside me. It wasn't a revelation, more like a quiet realization that I might be ready to look at myself differently. Richard finished his tea and smiled, and in that smile, there was not just sadness, but something like hope. I stared at the table where our mugs sat side by side, feeling the air in the kitchen grow heavier, like it was charged with something intangible. The silence that followed our conversation wasn't just a pause, it was alive, brimming with unspoken thoughts. Richard pushed his mug aside, his fingers trembling slightly as if he felt the tension too. I caught his gaze, and for a moment it felt like he could see right through me. We started talking again, but now our words were more careful, like we both knew we were teetering on the edge of something new. He asked if I'd ever been in a situation where I was too scared to take a step because I didn't know what came next. I nodded, thinking of times I'd backed away from possibilities because they felt too risky. Sometimes I wish I'd been braver, I said, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. Richard looked at me, and there was something in his eyes that made my chest tighten, a mix of curiosity and vulnerability. Courage comes when you can't do anything else, he said, his voice warm but with a slight tremor. He shared about the moment he finally let himself admit that his feelings for men weren't a mistake, but the truth. It wasn't a loud revelation, just a quiet choice to stop running from himself. My breathing deepened as our eyes met again. This time, the pause lingered, and I noticed his hand inching closer to mine on the table. It wasn't an obvious move, but it was enough to make my body tense with awareness. I didn't pull away, even though part of me screamed that this was dangerous, that I wasn't ready for what might happen. But another part, the one tired of pretending, wanted to stay. Have you ever felt like someone sees the real you? He asked softly, and I knew he wasn't just making conversation. I nodded, unable to find words because in that moment I felt exactly that. The kitchen, the glow of the lamp, his voice. It all became a world where I could be myself, even if just for a second. I didn't know what came next, but right then I didn't want the night to end. I could feel my pulse hammering in my temples as we sat in a silence that now felt louder than words. Richard looked at me, his gaze soft yet piercing, like he was waiting for me to make the next move. My hand still rested on the table, so close to his that I could sense the warmth of his skin, even though we weren't touching. Inside, I was torn between two urges, one pulling me to leave, to retreat to the safety of the familiar, and another begging me to stay, to trust this moment. He spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes I think life gives us a chance to be honest, but we're too scared to take it, he said, his words hanging in the air like a challenge. I wanted to respond, but my throat tightened, and instead of words, I just nodded. Then Richard, slowly, almost hesitantly, reached out and covered my hand with his. His touch was light, but it burned through me like an electric shock. Time seemed to freeze. I looked at his hand, then at him, and in his eyes I saw a mix of fear and determination. I'm not sure who moved first, but in the next moment he leaned toward me and I met him halfway. Our lips touched in a cautious, almost tentative kiss that lasted only a second, but turned everything inside me upside down. It wasn't passion or impulse. It was an acknowledgement, quiet and honest, of what we'd both been hiding for so long. We pulled back and my breath came out shaky. Richard stared at me, his eyes wide, like he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. I'm sorry if... he started, but I shook my head, cutting him off. Don't, I said softly, my hand still under his, proof that I wasn't backing away. In that moment, I knew that kiss wasn't just a fleeting act. It was a step toward a truth I'd avoided for too long. The kitchen hadn't changed, but everything felt different. The lamp's glow, the creak of the chair, even the air. It all became part of this new, fragile world we'd just created. I didn't know what came next, but for that 1 second, I felt more alive than I ever had. I looked at Richard, and the silence that followed our kiss was louder than any sound. My hand still rested under his, the warmth of his fingers a reminder of what had just happened. Outside, the sky was starting to lighten, the first hints of dawn painting the horizon in pale pink. We both stayed quiet, but it wasn't awkward. It was like we needed time to process that this moment had changed everything. Richard broke the silence first, his voice soft but steady. We don't have to figure this out right now, he said, his gaze gentle but serious. I nodded, relieved that he wasn't pushing for answers but also wasn't pulling away. We both knew this moment was too important to ignore, yet too fragile to dive into head first. Let's just give it time, he added, and I nodded again, because that was all I could manage. We sat for a few more minutes, not saying a word, just letting the silence speak for us. I noticed how he gave my hand a slight squeeze before letting go, and that gesture felt as significant as the kiss. We agreed, without words, to keep this between us for now, until we could make sense of what it meant. There were no promises or plans, just a quiet understanding that something had started, and we didn't want to lose it. When I finally stood to head back to my room, my legs felt heavier than before. Richard got up too, switching off the lamp above the table, and the kitchen dimmed into a soft half-light. "Good night," he said, a faint smile in his voice. "Good night," I replied, and we went to our separate rooms, but I knew sleep wouldn't come. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling something new growing inside me, not fear, but hope, mixed with a nervous thrill for what lay ahead. I drove down the empty road back to the city, the morning sun glaring through the windshield. Aiden's house was behind me, but the events of last night kept replaying in my head like a movie I couldn't pause. The morning had passed in a blur, breakfast with Aiden and his family, polite small talk about the weather and plans for the week. Richard was there, helping with the dishes, but we barely exchanged glances, like we were afraid someone might notice our secret. In the car, it was quiet, just the radio mumbling some old song I wasn't listening to. I kept thinking about how one night could upend everything you thought you knew about yourself. Richard, his words, his touch, his gaze, felt so real, yet almost like a dream I didn't want to forget. I caught myself smiling, remembering how he squeezed my hand before we parted, but the smile faded into unease. What now? Where was this going? I pulled into a gas station to grab coffee, and while waiting at the counter, I started replaying my life in my mind. The years I'd spent dodging questions about what I really wanted felt so empty now. I'd always thought loneliness was just part of being an adult, but now I wondered if it was a choice I'd made to avoid facing the truth. Richard showed me you could be honest even when it's scary, and that left me feeling both vulnerable and free. Back in the car, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Richard, short, just a few words. "Glad you came. Talk soon?" I stared at the screen, my heart picking up speed again. I didn't know what to say, but my fingers started typing on their own. "Yeah, let's talk." I hit send and let out a breath, realizing that small step was the start of something bigger. The road ahead stretched long, but for the first time in a while, I felt like I was driving in the right direction. I sat in my apartment, staring at the phone on the coffee table, like it could make decisions for me. A week had passed since that night at Aiden's house, and every morning I woke up thinking of Richard, his voice, his gaze, the way he made me feel seen. We'd been texting short but warm messages, like we were testing if this feeling would fade if we gave it time. "How was your day?" he'd write, or I'd ask how he was doing, each reply a small bridge connecting us across the distance. One evening, I gathered the courage to call him. His voice on the other end was as steady as it had been that night, but with a hint of excitement. "I've been thinking about you," he said after a long pause, and I felt warmth spread through my chest. We talked about simple things, work, the books he was reading, how I hated city traffic, but beneath those words was something deeper, like we were learning to trust each other step by step. I started noticing how my view of the world had shifted. I used to look at couples in cafes or on the street and think that wasn't for me, that I was too busy to find someone. Now I wondered if I'd just been too scared to admit what I wanted. Richard made me think about how long I'd lived avoiding the truth and how freeing it felt to finally face it. I didn't know where this connection would lead, but I was ready to find out. One day, I texted him, "Maybe we could meet up?" His reply came a few minutes later. "I'd like that." We agreed to meet the next week at a small cafe outside the city where no one knew either of us. Sitting in my apartment, I felt fear and hope wrestling inside me, but hope was winning. I looked out the window at the city lights flickering in the dark and thought, what if this is the start of a real life? What would you feel if you were scared to take a step but took it anyway? What's it like to stand on the edge of something new?